My name is Hugh Glass, a man of the West, fur trapper, and explorer of America's wild places. In 1823, the world was changing rapidly, with brave and fearless men venturing further west in search of wealth and new lands. I was one of those men, hunting furs for the expedition of William Henry Ashley, an important trader who led the group known as Ashley's 100. Life on the frontier wasn't for the weak. It was a harsh existence, shaped by the forces of nature and constant threats from both wild animals and hostile native tribes. The American plains were rapidly changing, with traders and trappers pushing the boundaries of known territory. Each new expedition brought stories of violent confrontations with the Sioux and Arikara tribes, who fiercely defended their lands against the invaders. The fur trade, with its promise of wealth, attracted fearless and desperate men ready to risk everything for an uncertain future. I stood out in this unforgiving world. Known for my physical strength, intelligence, and determination, I commanded respect among my peers. Tall and strong, with muscles built from hard work and eyes trained to scan the horizon for prey, I was a striking figure. My thick beard and long hair, bleached by the sun and time, told stories of many days spent in forests and mountains. My endurance was legendary. I survived battles, injuries, and diseases that would have defeated many others. I learned to endure pain and face fear as naturally as I breathed the cold morning air on the open plains. Each scar on my body was a silent testimony to a life lived on the edge, of deadly encounters with wild animals and fierce confrontations with men equally hardened by frontier life. The 1823 expedition was another of those epic adventures that would test every last bit of my endurance and will to live. Led by William Henry Ashley, we set out from St. Louis, navigating the waters of the Missouri, entering vast and dangerous territory. Each day brought new challenges, and each night, new dangers. But I was ready for them all. After all, this was the life I had chosen, and in a way, the life that had chosen me. Being a fur trapper was not just a job. It was a calling for those who were not satisfied with the simple and safe life of the cities. It was for those seeking something more, a primal connection with nature, a constant struggle for survival, and above all, a legacy left in the traces of America's expansion map. I was determined to leave my mark no matter how fiercely life might test me. The sun was still low on the horizon when we set out that morning, with mist hanging over the forest floor. I led the group as the lead hunter, a position of extreme responsibility. Behind me was Jim Bridger, a young man full of enthusiasm and youthful energy. John Fitzgerald brought up the rear, a man hardened by time and frontier experiences, always vigilant and distrustful. Our goal was clear: to find and kill animals whose furs were worth a fortune in the markets. The mission to hunt was vital for our survival and the success of William's expedition. We were deeply ingrained in the hunting routine, moving silently through the dense vegetation, our senses always on high alert. Every sound, every movement in the forest could indicate the presence of game or danger. As we advanced, the sound of birds and the rustle of leaves under our feet were the only noises accompanying us. The smell of damp earth and plants filled the air, and the morning chill was sharp, keeping us awake and alert. I led with firm and decisive steps, my rifle always ready, my eyes scanning every corner of the landscape ahead of us. It was during this silent march that everything changed. As I pushed aside the vegetation to clear the way, I came face to face with a terrifying sight: a huge grizzly bear, accompanied by her 2 cubs. Her brown fur gleamed under the rays of sunlight filtering through the tree canopy, and her eyes stared at me with a mix of curiosity and fury. There was no time to ponder or plan. The bear's maternal instinct made her charge with incredible speed. My heart raced, and in a desperate reflex I raised my rifle, trying to aim. However, before I could fire, the bear was already upon me. The impact was brutal. I was thrown to the ground, the colossal weight of the animal crushing my body against the earth. The bear's sharp claws tore into my flesh, each swipe a wave of excruciating pain. Her powerful jaws clamped onto my shoulder with devastating force, breaking the bone with a horrible crack that echoed in my ears. I screamed, a primal sound that reverberated through the forest, a desperate plea for help. I fought with all my strength, driven by a desperate will to survive. With my free hand, I managed to reach my knife and began stabbing the bear repeatedly, trying to fend her off. But she was relentless, determined to destroy me to protect her cubs. When the bear finally retreated, probably satisfied that she had removed the threat, I was unrecognizable. My leg was broken, twisted at a grotesque angle. Blood poured from deep gashes on my back, chest, and shoulder. Every breath was agony, and my vision began to blur from blood loss and extreme pain. I could taste the metallic tang of blood in my mouth, mixed with the smell of earth and sweat. The air around me felt heavy, laden with the scent of blood and fear. Every small movement sent waves of searing pain through my entire body. My companions, Bridger and Fitzgerald, arrived quickly, pale and horrified at the sight before them. Bridger, with wide eyes full of youthful panic, murmured, "My God, Hugh, what will we do?" Fitzgerald, always the pragmatist, tried to take control, but couldn't hide the tremor in his hands as they lifted me. "We have to get him to a safe place," he said, more to himself than to us. Every touch, every movement seemed to amplify the agony, but there was something else in their expressions, a mix of fear and guilt that I couldn't fully understand at the time. My clothes were soaked with blood, and the earth around me was stained red. My wounds were so deep that they exposed flesh and bone, a horrifying sight that would make any man doubt my survival. Lying in the darkness that night, every heartbeat was a struggle, every breath a challenge. But even amid so much pain and despair, a stubborn flame inside me refused to go out. I wasn't ready to give up, no matter how terrible the situation was. I heard Bridger and Fitzgerald speaking in low tones, discussing my fate. We all knew I was at death's door, and they were trying to decide what to do. Fitzgerald, always the pragmatist, suggested they leave me behind, while Bridger seemed torn, young and still full of hope. But deep down, we all knew the chances of my survival were slim. The sight of the stars above, the distant sound of nocturnal animals, and the constant pain were my companions that night. Even in a weakened state, my mind wandered, thinking about how we had reached this point and the strength it would take to face what lay ahead. I knew that if I had any chance of surviving, it would be through a determination and resilience beyond anything I had ever known. And so, in that cold and painful darkness, I made a decision. No matter how injured my body was, my will to live would be stronger. I would survive, not just for myself, but to show everyone, including myself, that true strength lies not only in muscles, but in the soul and the indomitable determination of a man. I woke up in a fog of pain and disorientation, my senses slowly coming back to life as the brutal reality set in. The pain was relentless, an unforgiving companion that made every breath a battle. I could hear muffled voices around me, and when my eyes finally adjusted to the light, I saw Major Henry talking with Fitzgerald and Bridger. Their expressions were serious, weighed down by the gravity of the situation. Major Henry knew my condition was worsening. My wounds showed no signs of improvement, and carrying me was putting the whole group at risk. He pondered the options, each one darker than the last. Finally, he made a difficult but necessary decision. He approached me, his eyes revealing the sadness and resignation behind his determination. "Hugh, we'll do what we can to keep you comfortable," he said, his voice firm but tinged with compassion. Fitzgerald and Bridger were tasked with staying with me, to watch over me until my last breath and then give me a proper burial. They built a rudimentary shelter for me, using branches and leaves to create a flimsy shade against the unrelenting sun. Fitzgerald, always practical, started digging my grave nearby, the rhythmic sound of the shovel hitting the ground a constant reminder of my impending mortality. Bridger, younger and perhaps still hopeful, tended to my wounds, cleaning them with whatever he had available, trying somehow to ease my pain. The days passed in a haze of fever and suffering. I was conscious enough to feel the passage of time, each day bringing a new wave of pain and despair. Fitzgerald and Bridger, caught between duty and survival, found themselves increasingly pressured. Indigenous patrols were a constant threat, and the presence of a dying man only heightened the danger for all of us. The tension was palpable, each of us aware that death could be just a breath away. Finally, Fitzgerald made a decision. Ever the pragmatist, he began to suggest to Bridger that it was time to leave. They had done all they could for me, and staying longer meant risking their own lives. Fitzgerald argued that they had already fulfilled their duty beyond what was expected, and remaining there was a death sentence for all. Bridger, young and impressionable, eventually gave in to Fitzgerald's cold logic. On a cold morning, I woke up feeling something was wrong. The camp was too quiet, and a dark premonition took hold of me. I forced my body to move, each motion torture, and saw that Fitzgerald and Bridger had left. They had taken my weapons, my knife, everything that could help me survive. The only thing they left was the bear pelt they used to cover me, a cruel reminder of my vulnerability. The feeling of abandonment was devastating. The betrayal burned like fire inside me. I had been left to die alone and defenseless in the middle of the wilderness. However, that betrayal ignited something within me. Anger, a desire for revenge, and above all, the determination to prove them wrong. I wouldn't die there. I wouldn't give them that satisfaction. I would survive. With a willpower I didn't know I possessed, I began to crawl. Every movement was agony, but every meter I advanced was a small victory. My wounds hurt terribly. The pain was constant, an unyielding companion. I used the little survival knowledge I had to find food, roots, wild berries, anything that could keep me alive. The stream's water nearby was my sustenance, and I used the bearskin to keep warm during the cold nights. The first days were a blur of fever and agony. The fever came in waves, making me dizzy and disoriented. Hunger was a constant, a dull pain that never completely went away. I ate anything I could find, from small insects to plants I hoped weren't poisonous. Exhaustion took over, my limbs refusing to obey. There were moments when I would just lay there staring at the sky, wondering if it was worth continuing, but then anger would burn inside me again, pushing me forward. Each crawl across the rough ground was a small victory, an affirmation of my determination to survive. Each small triumph, like finding a handful of berries, gave me a spark of hope, a reason to keep going. As I crawled, the world around me seemed distant, almost unreal. The sky above was a relentless blue during the day and dotted with bright stars at night. The sounds of the forest became my soundtrack. The rustling of leaves, the distant calls of birds, and occasionally the cry of a nocturnal animal. These sounds reminded me that life went on, indifferent to my struggle. The pain in my leg was unbearable, a constant reminder of the brutal attack. I used pieces of wood to improvise a splint, trying to stabilize the broken bone. My back and shoulders were covered in scars, the deep cuts now swollen and red with infection. I knew I needed to clean the wounds to prevent gangrene, so I used the cold stream water to wash the worst areas, enduring the searing pain as I did so. Each night was a battle against the cold and loneliness. The bearskin, though rough and heavy, was my only comfort, protecting me against the freezing winds and morning dampness. I curled up under it, trying to retain as much warmth as possible, and tried to sleep despite the pain and constant fear of being attacked by wild animals or discovered by hostile natives. As I struggled to survive, my mind fixated on a single goal: revenge. The thought of finding Fitzgerald and Bridger, of making them pay for their betrayal, kept me alive. It was a burning desire, a flame that burned within me, fueling my will to live. Each passing day, each meter I advanced, brought me a little closer to that goal. The journey was excruciating, and there were moments when despair threatened to overwhelm me. But I clung to any fragment of hope, any small victory. I refused to succumb to the darkness, refused to let Fitzgerald and Bridger's betrayal be the end of my story. I was determined to survive, not just for myself, but to show the world that a man, even wounded and abandoned, could find within himself the strength to fight against all odds. I woke up with the morning sun warming my skin and a fierce determination burning within me. I was alone, abandoned, but alive. Fort Kiowa was more than 200 miles away, and I knew it would be an almost impossible journey in my state. But there was no alternative. With my leg crudely immobilized and my wounds covered as best as I could, I began to crawl. Every movement was torture, but every inch I moved forward was a small victory. The first few meters were the hardest, my body protesting with every pull and push. The uneven, rocky ground hurt my hands and knees, but I kept going, driven by sheer willpower. The thought of revenge against Fitzgerald and Bridger fueled my determination. I was willing to endure any pain, any challenge, as long as I could survive. Hunger and thirst soon became relentless enemies. The small stream I found provided temporary relief, but the search for food was a constant battle. I fed on roots, wild berries and anything edible I could find. The bitter taste of some plants was hard to bear, but the need for survival outweighed any discomfort. The infection in my wounds was another constant concern. I used the stream water to wash the wounds, enduring the intense pain as I did so. In a desperate moment, I remembered the indigenous methods I had seen and let maggots clean the dead flesh from my wounds. It was an extreme measure, but every effort was necessary to keep gangrene at bay. The nights were especially difficult. The biting cold enveloped me, and I wrapped myself in the bear skin, trying to conserve as much heat as possible. I listened to the sounds of the forest around me, each snap and rustle potentially threatening. My mind wandered between wakefulness and sleep, always alert to any danger. The nights were long, but I forced myself to believe that each sunrise was a small victory, a step closer to survival. I also faced the threat of wild animals. One night, I was awakened by the sound of a wolf howling nearby. With my weakened body, any encounter could be fatal. I did my best to avoid detection, hiding among the rocks and dense vegetation. Adrenaline coursed through my veins at every suspicious sound, keeping me alert and ready to react. Amid my desperate journey, I encountered native tribes who surprisingly did not attack me. Instead, some showed compassion and helped me. I remember clearly the first group I met, a small Lakota tribe. I was exhausted, starving, and on the brink of despair when I stumbled upon their camp. They could have easily killed me, but instead, they offered help. The Lakota gave me water and basic food, helping me regain some strength. They examined my wounds and applied traditional remedies, using herbs I did not recognize but which brought immediate relief. The gratitude I felt was immense, and this small spark of humanity renewed my determination. I explained my situation as best as I could, and they gave me directions and advice on how to continue my journey. These encounters were not frequent, but each positive interaction was a reminder that there was kindness and compassion even in the darkest circumstances. There were other groups I met along the way, each contributing in some way to my survival. I learned to respect and value their cultures and ways of life, understanding that in the end, we were all just human beings trying to survive in this unforgiving world. As I crawled, each day brought new challenges, and each night, new uncertainties. But my determination was unwavering. I knew that revenge was a powerful motive, but I also knew that surviving would be the greatest victory against those who betrayed me. And so, I continued, one painful step at a time, driven by the unbreakable strength of a man who refused to die. As I moved forward, I had time to reflect on life, death, and the inner strength that drove me. Every obstacle overcome, every small victory against nature and my own body, reinforced the idea that true strength was not just in the muscles, but in the mind and spirit. I, Hugh Glass, was determined to survive not just for revenge, but to prove to myself and the world that a man can face the impossible and win. After weeks of excruciating travel, the sight of Fort Kiowa was an indescribable relief. My arms and legs trembled with exhaustion, and my body was on the brink of collapse. But seeing the fort meant I had survived against all odds. When I finally crossed the gates, I collapsed to the ground, unable to take another step. The men at the fort found me and immediately took me inside, where I began receiving the necessary care. The first days at Fort Kiowa were a blur of fever, pain, and medical treatment. The men who found me were astonished by the extent of my injuries and the fact that I had survived the journey. My wounds were cleaned and properly treated, and I was fed and hydrated regularly. I felt life slowly returning to my body, but the pain was still a constant companion. Every movement reminded me of the bear attack and the long journey I had faced. As days turned into weeks, I began to regain my strength. My body, though still marked by scars and wounds, was starting to heal. Gratitude for being alive mixed with a growing anger and desire for revenge. During my long hours of recovery, I thought incessantly about Fitzgerald and Bridger, the men who had abandoned me to die. Determined to find the men who betrayed me, my recovery was driven by a single purpose: to seek vengeance. As soon as I could stand and walk unassisted, I began to plan my search. The men at the fort shared information about Fitzgerald and Bridger's movements, and I soon discovered that Fitzgerald had joined the army and was stationed at Fort Atkinson. Bridger, on the other hand, was still nearby, hunting with other men. With my supplies replenished and my body relatively recovered, I left Fort Kiowa with a new objective. Anger and determination fueled me, each step bringing me closer to the opportunity to confront the men who left me to die. My mind was clear, focused on one thing: justice. My search led me back into the wilderness, where I finally found Bridger. He was camped with a group of trappers, and when he saw me, his eyes widened in surprise and fear. To him, I was a ghost, a haunting from the past he thought he had left behind. His youth and inexperience were written on his face, and I saw there a boy who had been led to a terrible decision by an older, more calculating man. Confronting Bridger was a moment of intense emotion. My first instinct was anger, but seeing the fear and guilt in his eyes, something inside me softened. He wasn't the true villain of the story. He was just a boy influenced by Fitzgerald. I remember grabbing the young man by the collar, my voice laden with anger and frustration, but also with an unexpected compassion. "You left me to die, boy," I said, my voice rough and charged with emotion. "But I survived, and I'm here to settle the score." Bridger, trembling, begged for forgiveness, explaining how Fitzgerald had convinced him to abandon me. After a long silence, I let him go. "Go away, Jim," I finally said. "You were young and were led into this, but don't forget what you did." I decided to forgive him, not out of weakness, but because I saw his humanity and the negative influence of Fitzgerald. By forgiving Bridger, I was, in a way, beginning my own healing process, though the pursuit of Fitzgerald was far from over. My determination didn't wane. I knew I still had a debt to settle with Fitzgerald. My journey was far from over, and the anger driving me still burned intensely. Every step I took towards the next confrontation was loaded with purpose and resolve. I, Hugh Glass, wouldn't rest until Fitzgerald faced the consequences of his actions. After the encounter with Bridger, my determination to find Fitzgerald only intensified. The information I gathered at Fort Kiowa indicated that he had enlisted in the army and was stationed at Fort Atkinson. It was a long journey, but I was ready for any challenge. With renewed supplies and my strength partially recovered, I set out for the fort. The journey was arduous, but anger and determination fueled each step. I traversed dangerous territories, facing both harsh weather and the constant risk of encounters with hostile tribes. The wilderness was unforgiving, but with each passing day, my survival skills seemed to grow stronger. Hunger and thirst were constant companions, but I had learned to find sustenance in nature, eating roots, wild berries, and occasionally small animals I managed to catch. My nights were lonely, but filled with reflection. Every rustle in the forest, every distant howl reminded me of life's fragility, but the thought of finding Fitzgerald and delivering justice kept my will burning bright. The journey was long, taking weeks of grueling travel, but I finally saw Fort Atkinson on the horizon. My heart pounded with anticipation for the confrontation to come. I arrived at Fort Atkinson and immediately started asking about Fitzgerald. The presence of a stranger with my battle-scarred appearance drew attention, and I soon learned that Fitzgerald was there, serving in the army. I waited for the right moment, my body tense with expectation, anger and frustration simmering beneath the surface. When I finally saw Fitzgerald, he was in uniform, walking through the fort. As I approached, he didn't recognize me at first. I stopped in front of him, and the surprise on his face was clear when he realized who I was. His eyes widened and he stepped back, probably expecting an immediate attack. "Fitzgerald," my voice was a growl, full of contained rage. "You left me to die." The stark silence around us made my words echo even more. He tried to justify his actions, claiming he was just trying to survive, that the native threat was real and he had no choice. But his words rang hollow to me. The betrayal still burned deep, and my desire for vengeance was palpable. However, the presence of other soldiers and the military structure around us reminded me that I couldn't just kill him there. Fitzgerald was under the army's protection, and any impulsive action could result in my own death or imprisonment. I grabbed him by the collar, bringing his face close to mine. "You took my weapons, my means of survival," I said through clenched teeth, the anger burning in my eyes. "I want my gun back." Fitzgerald, realizing I wouldn't kill him there, but still fearing for his life, promised to return my weapon. He went to his quarters and came back with my rifle. I took the gun, feeling a small sense of justice, but it was not yet complete. I looked deep into his eyes, making it clear that although I spared his life, he wasn't forgiven. "Don't think this is over," I warned. "You lived because you're under the Army's protection. If you ever leave here, I'll be waiting." Fitzgerald nodded, aware that his life hung by a thin thread and that outside the military's protection, he wouldn't have the same luck. With my gun in hand, I turned and left the fort, leaving him behind, but with the certainty that he knew the shadow of vengeance still loomed over him. As I left Fort Atkinson, I felt a significant weight lift off my shoulders. My quest for vengeance had sustained me up until that moment, but now, with Fitzgerald spared, a new perspective emerged. The justice I sought was incomplete, but survival and the proof of my resilience had become a new kind of victory. I had overcome betrayal, pain, and the insurmountable challenges of nature. In doing so, I had found a new strength within myself, something that no one could take away. With this feeling of renewal, I continued my life as a hunter and explorer, always immersed in the nature I loved, and that had nearly killed me. My fame spread, and my story was told and retold in taverns and around campfires, inspiring others to seek the same courage and determination. I knew that true strength did not reside solely in muscles, but in the mind and the indomitable spirit of a man. I, Hugh Glass, had become a living legend, a symbol of human resilience and the ability to overcome the most extreme adversities.